Good morning.
Good morning.
And happy Easter, and welcome to those of you who are here, and welcome to those who are streaming with us this morning. You all know the story of Jesus showing up in Bob Dylan's hotel room in Tucson, Arizona. It was 1979, my last year in high school, and Bob was struggling. He was at a concert in San Diego, and Bob said toward the end of the show, someone in the crowd could see that he wasn't doing well, and they threw a silver cross on the stage. And he said, and you'll catch this as his words, "Now usually I don't pick things up in front of the stage. Once in a while I do, sometimes I don't. But I looked down at the cross, I said, I gotta pick that up." So I picked up the cross and I put it in my pocket, and I brought it backstage, and I brought it to the next town, which was out in Arizona. Now later, he is in Arizona, in Tucson. He said, I was feeling worse than I'd felt when I was in San Diego. I said, well, I need something tonight. I don't know what that is. I used all kinds of things. I said, I need something tonight that I didn't have before. And I looked in my pocket, and I had this cross. And Bob said, Jesus did appear to me as King of Kings and Lord of Lords. There was a presence in the room that couldn't have been anybody but Jesus. Jesus put his hand on me. It was a physical thing. I felt it. I felt it all over me. I felt my whole body tremble. The glory of the Lord knocked me down, and it picked me up. This is a well-known story that Bob told to a New Zealand journalist, and it's the story of Jesus rocking the rocker. And if you're a Dylan fan, you know that Bob was never the same after that. And I wonder if you also know the story, quite well known, of how Jesus rocked Dr. Mary C. Neal's life. Mary was 10 feet underwater. Her kayak was pinned in some rocks under a waterfall in remote Chile. And she knew she was going to die, and she had a choice to make. And she said, "Thy will be done," as in the Lord's Prayer, "Thy will be done." And to her surprise, immediately she felt held by Jesus. She said it was a physical thing, and she knew she was not alone. And asked later, after she came back to life, how she knew it was Jesus. She said, well, I knew it was Jesus the way I would know my husband of 30 years if I bumped into him in a grocery store. She said, I was a nobody, and I couldn't believe when he held me. I felt like a somebody. And I began to see that everybody is a somebody. And Jesus cared for her and took her up into the heavens, and she could see her bloated body underneath the water, dead. And yet, while she was in the heavens, she experienced a whole life review that wasn't filled with dark judgment, but rather brought great understanding and deep grace. And she was met by people or spirits or souls, whatever the word might be, who knew her and loved her and delighted to see her. She felt at home as never before. She felt loved as never before. She felt and saw color as never before. She describes an incredible story of walking on a path that is woven by the fibers of divine love. And as many of you know, Mary was dead for 31 minutes, and she was told that it wasn't her time, and she came back into her body and was on the shore, and two men appeared out of nowhere and brought her to an ambulance that appeared out of nowhere. And later, when she was in the hospital, her life was again rocked by Jesus. She experienced an out-of-body experience where she went up into the heavens and she sat with Jesus. And in one of her books, she is asked always to describe what Jesus looks like. And she said, well, though these are not words that we would use, Jesus looked like endless kindness and compassion. He seemed to know both the pain and the joy of the world, its beauty, its ugliness. He absorbed it all, and he covered it all with love. She said that human language is not up to the task of describing what Jesus looks like. She said perhaps it might be something like if you took all skin color and put it together, and all eye color and put it together, and all hair color and put it together, he looked something like that. And she was riveted by him and couldn't take her attention off him. And she didn't want to be anywhere but in his presence. And then she again was told it was time to return to her body. Now, the story of Mary's miraculous recovery and the extraordinary changes and things that she learns from Jesus and in the heavens are all in her 2 books and on YouTube if you're so interested. Now, these stories of Jesus showing up and rocking people's lives, that's what the gospel is about. And the gospel, according to John, is written to rock the world. And the last 2 chapters of the gospel, as you know, chapters 20 and 21, are stories, shocking and complete on rocking stories of people who experience Jesus as alive. But in experiencing Jesus as alive, they experience divine life, which is different than the life that we know by just being born. And John's gospel is often referred to as the gospel of life, but the word life in Greek isn't the same word that we use for life, a life that ends in death. The word in Greek is a life that never ends. So the story that Father John just read is the story which we listen and pray to every Easter morning of Jesus rocking Mary Magdalene's world when she showed up at the garden tomb. I mean, when Jesus appeared to her, as you know, she had absolutely no idea who he was. She was looking for a dead guy wrapped in a burial cloth, kind of like we might think of mummified people in Egypt. And of course, she thought he was the gardener. But the best part of the story is that Jesus rocks her when he uses her name, Mary. And game changer. And as you know, Mary explodes out of the garden, runs back, the first apostle of the resurrection. Her death narrative becomes a life narrative, and she is forever different. And as you know, later in the day, the disciples that Mary's a part of, Jesus rocks their world. They're huddled in hiding out of fear, and Jesus appears among them behind a locked door, his body beyond our categories of physical and spiritual, and they are cowering in fear. And he says to them, peace. And then he says it again. They must have needed a double dosage. And his very presence is divine peace. And they burst with joy. And then he breathed his spirit upon them to convey himself to them. We all know the story that a week later, again they're in the upper room. The door is locked. And Thomas, who missed out on Jesus' appearance, says he's not going to believe any of this stuff unless he can touch the palm of his hands and the spear in his side. And Jesus somehow knows this and appears to them, and he invites Thomas to touch his wounds. And Thomas blurts out, "My Lord and my God." He's completely changed by the very invitation. And speaking of Jesus' body and his wounds, I stumbled on a story that I'd already known but had forgotten about a little boy who died on an operating table. I think he was 4 years old. And they all knew he died, and then he came back to life because the monitor and the doctors know when you die. And he was saying to his parents that while he was dead, he met a girl who kept saying, I'm your sister," and kept hugging him. And he thought she was totally annoying. And that girl, turns out, the parents, of course, had never told him that they had had a girl who had died in utero, and that must have been the girl. And this little boy told his parents that he met Jesus, and he kept saying, well, Jesus has got markings. They didn't know what he was talking about. And one day when they were playing with markers, he said, well, Jesus has markings too, you know, and they're here. And he pointed toward his palm and the back of his hand. Back to John's Gospel, you also know the story in chapter 21 where the disciples are out fishing, and of course they're fishing. They fish all night long because it's too hot to fish during the day, and fishermen know fish don't like hot. And and they see that it's Jesus on the shore, and they come into the shore, and Jesus is cooking breakfast for them. And he says to them, which I love, no one dared speak because they knew it was Jesus. And then later in that breakfast, Jesus rocks Peter's world. He rocks Peter's life by three times asking him, do you love me? And of course, undoing Peter's 3 denials the night before Jesus' death. And so Jesus here is like a doctor who has to re-break a bone in order to properly set it. And so he re-breaks Peter's soul. It's so painful because on the 3rd time Peter says to him, Lord, you know everything. You know I love you. Just tearful. And Peter is fixed. Jesus heals him with love and commissions him for love. Okay, so John's gospel is telling us something, and he's telling us that beautiful prologue in chapter 1, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, that beautiful 18 verses of the incarnate one in the heavens who comes down to earth, and the Jesus who walked along the shores of the Sea of Galilee, the Jesus who was hung up on a tree, as we just sang, was crucified and ascended into the heavens, who, as Archbishop Rowan, the most brilliant of archbishops of Canterbury, said to me when I was asking him this particular question, he said to me, well, the second person of the Trinity has a heart for humans. He's talking about Jesus, of course, whose spirit is in the world, is the same Jesus who showed up in Bob Dylan's hotel room in Tucson, underwater for Mary Neal, on the operating table for this little boy and for billions and millions of normal people, and is present with us here this morning. Unfortunately, we don't always let Jesus and the resurrection rock our world. We dumb down Jesus and we dumb down the resurrection and we shrink it to the size of our minds. And it's super hard not to do this. We often diminish aspects of the resurrection because it does not jive with 9th grade earth science, 10th grade biology, 11th grade chemistry, or 12th grade physics, which I never took, but I'm sure it doesn't jive with that either. And it doesn't jive with Enlightenment thinking that formed by our forebears in our country. We hold Enlightenment thinking as the highest of all thinking. And so we turn out to be somewhat like Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson was a man of the Enlightenment. He was not interested in mystery. Not everything was rational and could be explained. So he took scissors to his New Testament and he cut out all the miracles in every passage that had to do with the mystery of God, which means the Bible became incredibly small, right? The Bible is about the mystery of God, and it's as demonstrated in this person, the New Testament at least, in this person of Jesus. And so the limits of our materiality and the limits of our spirituality, they dull our soul. Our soul has sensors in it, just like we have 5 physical senses. And when the soul gets dulled, we get locked into ourselves and we get locked out of the divine dimension that is available to us in daily life. We miss the reality of the resurrected Jesus, just like Mary missed it and thought Jesus was the gardener. We have oftentimes the wrong narrative in our head. The resurrection breaks every single paradigm, including the biblical paradigms of the Hebrew people, which Jesus was. Jesus was a Hebrew man devoted to his tradition, but the people, some of the people in Jesus' tradition at the time, believed in the resurrection, but only at the end of time, and certainly not one guy in the middle of time. So the only boundaries that are on the boundless Jesus are the boundaries that we put upon him. And if we had resurrection retinas and gospel glasses, we would see that divine life permeates all life. Just like water is in a fish, and a fish swims in water. And we would see that the resurrection energy is released for the renewal and restoration of the world, and it permeates all life forms from atoms to cells to souls to solar systems. Now, oddly enough, one of the things that we do to dumb down the resurrection is we say that Jesus, some of us say, is the greatest teacher of all time. I happen to believe that, but to put Jesus just in that category is to miss the point. I will say that imagine if we actually did what Jesus taught, individually and as a world, if we actually lived his love ethic, it would rock the world. I mean, just take a look at a few things from the Sermon on the Mount, his teachings. Love God, love your neighbor, love your enemies, pray for those who curse you, do not be angry, forgive, don't judge, pray, serve, be humble, go the extra mile. The last shall be first. Lose your life to find it. The meek shall inherit the world. When you clothe someone, you clothe Jesus. When you visit someone in prison, you visit Jesus. And then, of course, the teachings about himself, that he came that we might have abundant life, that we might have the deepest possible peace, and that we might have his joy. There are other incredible genius teachers of divine inspiration. There are genius teachers of generative genius that are the cause of whole cultures in countries. Teachers that we all learn from and should learn from. And I mean no denigration or depreciation of any of those teachers. But all of those teachers are dead. They're dead. And their teachings live on, but they're dead. Jesus is the only of the great teachers who is alive. The number one proclamation that Christians have is that Jesus is alive. And the Jesus movement, the Messianic Jesus movement, did not go away because Jesus did not go away. There are many other Messianic movements around Jesus' time, and they all died when the so-called Messiah died. And Jesus' followers would die instead of lie and say that he was not alive. So if we do not shrink Jesus down, he'll rock your world. And if you experience Jesus as alive, he'll rock your world. You'll be changed. And perhaps the most shocking thing about Jesus is that he is personal and loving. This is not an abstract force that's out there. And that's what the whole thing is. The whole thing is a personal love story. He met Mary with the most personal thing she had, her name. He met the disciples cowering in fear with peace. He met Thomas and said, "Touch my wounds." When's the last time you stuck your wounds out for somebody to touch? He fed hungry disciples who've been working all night, and he released Peter from self-hatred. I'm just going to pause there for a second. Take a look at your own life. Take a look at your own self-hatred, and imagine Jesus releasing you from your self-hatred so that your soul might abound in abundant love, commissioned for love. That's what Jesus does for Peter, and that's how he meets each of us. He meets us personally and with a super careful love. He meets us with a love that is tailored to who each of us is, and he meets us wherever we are. That includes being alive, and it includes being dead. He might meet you in a hotel room or underwater or in a garden or in a room locked, on a beach, on an operating table, in a pew. Wouldn't that be cool? Streaming on your computer at home in your daily life, or perhaps when you come to receive communion with an open palm and an open heart. And Jesus is not just rocking the lives of pious followers. He is not just for Christians, people who follow. He shows up in people's lives of all stripes and all types, regardless of religion, no religion, or theological disposition. Atheists, agnostics, and those 23% of Americans who check none on the Pew Research poll for religious affiliation. If you have any question about this, take a look at the poll that polls the 20 million Americans who have had near-death experience. 75% of those people who are atheists and agnostics say that Jesus or God showed up for them in their near-death experience. He is a man for all seasons and for all people, for all time. His love knows no boundaries. Now, in the 80s, I think it was the 80s, there was this popular rock and roll ditty that had the line, "Rock this town, rock it inside out." A fantastic little song. It doesn't really mean anything, but a terrific song. And that's what Jesus does. He rocks us from the inside out. He is inviting each of us to a whole new consciousness. He's inviting each of us to a completely different way of life. And it is one, and this is the cool thing, that is infused with Him. When I asked Archbishop Rowan about his prayer life, and he was commenting on mine, he said, I pray these words of Jesus because I know that Jesus is praying within me, and I like to use His words as a prayer within me. And when He infuses your life and you come to understand that, you're infused with a life that does not end, a love that does not end, and a light that does not end. He's inviting us to put on resurrection retinas and gospel glasses and to be a new creation. The story we just read is about a new creation. And He is inviting us all to be secret agents of love in this broken and crazy world. And He's beckoning us all to be rocked and to get out of our heads. Now, some of you are going to be like, man, I know exactly what he's talking about. And others are going to be like, I have absolutely no idea what the guy's talking about. And whether or not you know what I'm talking about or you don't know what I'm talking about, one of the great things we all do on Easter is we run to the tomb. Go to the tomb and look for Jesus. You might not recognize Him right away. You might think He's the gardener or something else, but go there because He'll show up.